Okay. And let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, can you all see that okay?
Yeah. Uh-oh, wait a minute. I think you're muted.
I am muted. Here we are at the last class, which is sort of amazing to me. It seemed like first, how am I going to squeeze the entire Tanakh into 9 weeks? But I think that we've done it, respectfully. And tonight we're going to finish it up, which I'm looking forward to. It was fun for me to review these last few books of the Bible. Let's see if I can make this work. Yeah, there we go. So I just put the calendar up there so you can see all that we accomplished. And of course, the Tanakh. And we're in Ketuvim, and what we're working on tonight, you can see, are the last books, but also the book of Job. And I did that purposely. We're actually going to talk about Job last. These books in the Ketuvim have been arranged and rearranged differently. The Christians actually have them in a different order. But regardless, this worked out well for our purposes. So just to begin, let's just do a little history review. Jerusalem falls in 586 BCE. And prior to that, before it fell, the king at the time, King Jehoiakim, along with other like dignitaries and upper class, were already taken into exile in Babylonia. And that, by the way, is historically way that things are often done, even as recent as when the Germans went into Poland. The first thing they did was they went in and took academics and dignitaries sort of as, war prisoners or political prisoners or something. And that took away the main defenses. So when they were able to just roll into Poland because all these people were already gone. So Jehoiachin is already gone. And when the temple's destroyed, the Babylonians have it, they raise it, it's gone, it's completely gone. And all of the prominent citizens that are left are taken. But people, which is often overlooked, people were left in the land. It wasn't devoid of Jews. Actually, in no time in history were there no Jews in the land. The Am Haaretz, which is to say, it's not a nice term actually, but it's basically the salt of the earth, the simpletons, the not just even farmers, but really lower rung, maybe intellectually, certainly financially, they all remained. Babylonia had no need for them. We don't know much about them. We don't know really what happened to them. Maybe they took over land that was abandoned by the deportees. Maybe the land was overrun by other local tribes, not Judeans, that were there. We really don't know much about this at all. And of course, the folks that did go to Babylon see themselves as the inheritors of the Jewish nation. They sort of don't give any mind to the people back in the land. And then Babylonia, about 50 years later or so, falls to Persia. And 50 years after the fall after Jerusalem falls, Cyrus, who's king of Persia, allows the Jews to go back. Now, it's not to go back to be sovereign in their nation. It's just to go back to worship their own God, right? So he's taking this foreign people that have thrived in Babylonia and saying, you can go back. And the interesting piece is, of course, not everyone went back, right? 1948, Israel's a state. We didn't all run there, right? And the same thing is true then. The people had made lives in Babylonia. The generation had passed. They had businesses, and they weren't anxious to go back. They didn't know what they would find. It was a war-torn country. So that brings us to Ezra and Nehemiah, or Ezra and Nehemiah. And originally, this was one book. And it's split over time, and only, as it says here, in the 15th century, is it like split everywhere. So today there are two separate books, but Ezra actually doesn't appear until almost the end of the book of Ezra, and he has an appearance in the book of Nehemiah. So it makes a lot of sense. It was one book, but it was long, and so they eventually split it up. And these are the only two completely historical books in Ketuvim. All of the other books are either like the book of Ruth, you could say, is a history, but it's also maybe allegory, or irony, the story of Purim, if it happened at all. So a little bit historical, but certainly not the history of the nation. And also a lot of people just think that it's, again, an ironic allegory. So really, Ezra and Nehemiah are the only real history narratives that continue the story of the Jewish people. Parts of the book are in Aramaic, which is very interesting when they try to date when the books were written, and also why is it in the Bible. But also Daniel we'll speak to Daniel tonight as well, is also in Aramaic. And I think it's only these two books in the entirety of the Tanakh that have any real sections of Aramaic. The book of Esther does have certainly some words that aren't Hebrew, but because they were living in a foreign land. But to have a real section in Aramaic is fairly unusual. And chronologically, they are the last two books of the Tanakh. Now, they're not the last two books in the way the Tanakh is ordered. Actually, the book of Chronicles is, which we'll also talk about tonight. But they are chronological in terms of the history of the Jews. The story of the Jewish people ends with those two books in terms of in biblical knowledge of the Jewish people. It recounts the return in 586. Deals with that period of restoration when people going back, as we'll see, and the province. This province is known as Yehud, which probably is a Arabic-ish term for Jew, Yehuda, and we're talking 6th centuries BC. Okay, so. The book of Ezra begins with a census, a very detailed census of who went back. Ezra, by the way, is not part of this group that goes back. And there's something to be said that it was a little bit of a ragtag kind of a group of a little bit maybe zealots, a little bit people that didn't do well in Babylonia or were maybe seeking their fortune, in going back. If you think about the early Europeans that came to this country, they weren't the cream of the crop. I mean, if you all saw Frisco Kid, which is a fabulous movie with Gene Wilder, they send the schlepper rabbi, who's going to go to this new land, right? Who wants to leave what's known and comfortable? When they arrive, they set up an altar and they celebrate Sukkot. Now, Sukkot plays really an interesting role throughout the temple history because we are told that Solomon, when he dedicated his temple, it was during Sukkot. And they celebrate Sukkot here, and then eventually they'll dedicate the temple at Sukkot. And it ties into the Hanukkah story, which, by the way, we're not talking about at all because that's not in the Tanakh. But the Hanukkah story there is, and I don't know if you've ever studied the text of it, in the books of the Maccabees themselves, which are, again, not part of our Bible, they don't mention that story of the oil anywhere. That's not from the books of the Maccabees. That's from the Talmud, written much, much later, a couple thousand miles away. What is written in the books of the Maccabees was when they went to rededicate the temple and light, the menorah or whatever, they celebrated Sukkot, which is how many days long?
7.
Right? 7 days plus Shmini Atzeret, 8 days. And so there's certainly plenty of academicians and others like myself that believe that the story of the oil was invented by the rabbis to give a religious spin to all of this. But in fact, the 8 days of Hanukkah are due to the 8 days of Sukkot. But that's just an opinion. So they lay the foundation of the temple. By the way, there were about 42,000 people that went back. So it wasn't a small group. But hundreds of thousands had gone to Babylonia. And the census, by the way, includes how many servants went. So they had servants and the horses and the mules and the camels. So they didn't go back with nothing, right? They weren't like the pioneers going across this country with like just a wagon. They had. And then they this text, which I find very beautiful and can be read in two different ways. And you can see it begins with how they sang songs and they're praising God. This is when they set up the foundation for the new temple. And in verse 12, the priests and the Levites and the chiefs of the clans and the old men who had seen the first temple wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house. Many others shouted joyously. So why weeping and why joy? What are different reasons why these old men who had seen the first temple are weeping?
Emotion.
Which emotion?
Having lost the first temple,
Okay,
and then
so
joy having gotten the second one.
joy at seeing, right, it come back to life, or the second temple, the startings of the second temple couldn't hold a candle to the majesty of Solomon's temple. And the old men who saw the first temple just wept at what was lost. The young people were shouting joyously, we did it, we did it. The old men, perhaps, I mean, this is just a way of looking at the text, that the old men said, guys, we're never going to get there. We're not sovereign. This is never going to be the magnificent temple that Solomon built. And so it's a really interesting time period for them.
Could it also be that they couldn't believe that they had actually gotten back to Jerusalem?
Absolutely. It could be just being so overcome with, as Naomi said, with just pure emotion that that we did it. It's amazing that we got here, and to be able to live long enough to see that. So it could really be either way. So the going is not going to be easy, because there are locals, both people who are from the ancient Judea, tribe of Judah, or the kingdom of Judah, but also all kinds of others that have moved into the land. 50 years, that's 2 generations. Other things happen. And there are a lot of local adversaries that aren't so happy that these folks are coming from Babylonia and rebuilding something that was from so long ago. And yet it also goes in the other direction, that some of the Judeans, the Jews who had remained there for 50 years, they come to help, and their help is refused. That the Babylonian Jews feel somehow like, well, you stayed here, you're not quite so pure, and you didn't suffer like we did, and you didn't keep on the true Judaism, and what was wrong with you that you weren't brought into captivity? And once they are refused, these people then in many ways go to thwart the efforts, right? So you have this internal struggle between these few folks. Meanwhile, Cyrus, I guess, died or was deposed, and the new guy that's in charge is Darius. And it's Darius that eventually sends another group back to Judea, because they get word that things aren't going well. So finally, and as I said, it's like the end of the book, chapter 7 out of 10, we finally meet Ezra. And give me 1 second to just keep up. He's introduced with a complete lineage going all the way back to Aaron. So clearly the writers of this want to establish that he is a right and just inheritor of leadership. And he's also listed as the scribe of the law of Moses. And in fact, we often refer to him as Ezra the scribe. So there is a tradition that he actually was the one who wrote down the Torah, that until then it had been just oral. And if you remember, I don't expect you to remember, but Josiah, a few generations back, found the law, and many people feel that might have been the book of Deuteronomy, or maybe Ezra wrote Deuteronomy and Josiah found the other parts. Like, it's not at all clear, but it does raise questions about where the Torah actually comes from, and what was Ezra's role in all this. He is given permission by Darius, because they hear in Babylonia things are not going well, and he's given permission by Darius to lead a second wave to return to the land. And when they get to Jerusalem, they find that the people, the first wave of folks, sort of gave into what was life there. They completely intermingled with others. They married daughters of other peoples. They list all these other people, Moabites, Amorites, whatever. And what's written in the book is, it says that when Ezra hears this, he rents his garments, he tears his clothes, tore the hair out of his head and beard, and sat in desolation. He's in mourning, right? In Babylonia, they were foreigners, and they were able to keep to themselves as other. In the land of Judea, it seems backwards, but it was much easier to assimilate, and that's what was happening. But, which is a little hard for us to reconcile today with modern sensibilities, he basically tells them that they all have to divorce their wives, these foreign women, and they do, which is a little appalling given the way that we look at Judaism today, and how we welcome people into our customs and whatnot. So it's not a very happy place in the Bible for me. So, and then we get to the book of Nehemiah, and Ezra doesn't get very far in terms of building the temple. So there's a guy that goes back to Babylonia, and Nehemiah asks how the Jews doing. He hears that things are a mess, and that whatever wall had been there in Jerusalem, full of breaches. You can't defend a city if there are breaches in the wall. The gates had been destroyed by fire, and he instantly knows the problem. And look at his words. We've offended you, capital Y, by not keeping the commandments, and therefore Jerusalem's a mess. So whose fault is it? Yeah, please, Diane.
It just seems like Ezra is a little, I don't know. What did he expect to happen to the people? I mean, they had no leadership. They had no temple. They were left, because they were the lower bottom half of the community. I don't know what he expected from them.
It's a really interesting thing.
Higher parts of the community falter. I mean, the golden calf.
All throughout our history. I mean, when people, cry and moan, the Pew Report, the new Pew Report just came out. There's been 1,000 conferences already about what does it mean for us as Jews. It's never been any different, guys. Mm-hmm. This concept of, oh my gosh, will Judaism survive? Really, since the time of Abraham. It's never been any different. So I take a little solace in that, but it's also like, can't we do a little bit better after a few thousand years? But Nehemiah basically says it's our fault. We didn't keep the commandments and God punished us. And the only way to rebuild Jerusalem is for everyone to come back to Judaism. Now, this is an argument that's an approach to theology that I can't deal with, because when you extrapolate to modern times, and there are people that do believe that Hitler came about because the Jews weren't religious enough. And my theology can't accept that. That doesn't work for me, but it's clearly within the mainstream of Judaism. And so Nehemiah says to them, the way to succeed is you have to come back and be honest. It's our fault. We sinned. So he now gets permission to go to Jerusalem along with a letter of safe passage. And the letter allows him to fell timber from the king's forest. Don't forget, they don't own the land, right? They're not sovereign in the land. And so everything belongs to the king of Persia, but he has permission to go and cut down wood and to start building. And once there, he goes on these night prowls, apparently. And he wants to check things out like quietly. And he finds that everything's in really bad shape. The walls really does have holes, et cetera, et cetera. And he suggests that maybe we should fix things up. And people laugh at him, saying, no, you're wrong, you're completely wrong. This would be treasonous against the king. So you've got two sides. You've got the side that with Nehemiah that want to rebuild the walls, and you have a side that's afraid of the king, and they feel that bad things will happen to them if they support Nehemiah. And so you've got a real struggle, but the Judeans that follow Nehemiah actually arm themselves and keep working with their weapons at their side. So not the first time that Israel was building a nation back in the 1800s and early 1900s. This is also how they built, right, with weapons at their side. So some of the Jews start to complain that they're hungry, that their fields they're working too hard. Nehemiah wants to complete this wall so they can protect Jerusalem, and they're saying we just can't do it. And he guilts them into submission. So the wall gets built, and I love this quote. That you might think this wall that we're told is 15 feet thick, and you might think like, well, how could you lose a wall like this? We can't find it. So maybe all these stories are just bunk. And then lo and behold, in 2007, they found parts of this wall, which is really just amazing, and the amazing part of uncovering history. This is the wall that they imagine would have existed. And just to let you know, this would be the Temple Mount up here. And really the city of David, the ancient city of David, was here. Today, West Jerusalem is off to this way, like modern Jerusalem is off this way. And this is part of East Jerusalem. And up here is the Mount of Olives. And they imagine that this whole thing was this 15-foot thick wall that they weren't able to find. And this is what it looks like when they found it. So you can see it's massive. it's truly massive, and it's quite a wonder to see in person. Okay, so now anyway, there's been some back and forth competition over the archaeology of this, but we'll leave that for another class. So that's basically the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so now this wall is built, and that's the end of the history. That's as far as we know in the Tanakh. We then have these two books. Baby, I can, yeah, sure. Yeah, the left is here. As long as she doesn't start crying. Okay. This is Maya. So she's going to start to cry. It's not going to work. So who? Yeah, don't play with the keys, sweetheart. Who wrote the book? This is called the Chronicles, and they're at the very end of the Tanakh. There's parts 1 and 2, and of course, like everything else, we don't exactly know much about it. And in fact, they say that this is the book that we know the least about from all the books in the Tanakh. So that's a pretty, big position to be in. Other than the named prophets, and at least we knew that those were about prophets, very few among us have any idea that these books exist or what's in them. Like most Jews have never heard of this. I don't know if you've ever heard of Chronicles, but most Jews, if you say to them, name the books of the Bible, and they come up with random names, they're not going to come up with Chronicles. The name literally means in Hebrew, Divrei Hayamim, the words of the day. I always think of it like the congressional record. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a while. I don't know how many of you relate to that, but the congressional record, they log every single thing that is said in Congress. And this is what the Chronicles sort of is, with a twist. Okay, so what are the books? They have a brief genealogy of our people, starting with Adam, and they go through the books of Kings, sort of, and they end just before the history of Ezra and Nehemiah. Historically, some people used to list this book at the beginning of Ketuvim, but regardless, so it's listed as the last book. I just said all that. The tradition has Ezra being the author, that he came and sort of wrote this history for the new Judeans. And sources think, from their literary criticism, they think this is when it was put together. And of course, it has the history, but it's history with an agenda. And it's really interesting, right? Like, that line, the victors write the history books. So who's writing this and why, right? This is a look back, and they definitely have an agenda to it. And I can't see the whole screen. Actually, can someone read this aloud? Because I can't really see all of it.
The purpose of this history seems to have been to trace the origin of the temple and to show the antiquity and authenticity of its cult and of the formal legalistic type of religions that dominated later in Judaism.
Right. So they have this temple cult. They have to justify it. That's all that it's about, is justifying not only this, but as we'll see, King David as well. And that's how King David rises to such prominence, because as we briefly saw, he wasn't such a great guy. None of the kings were. Can somebody, Diane, you want to read this part too?
On the whole, Chronicles was regarded with suspicion. Its historical accuracy was doubted by the Talmudic authorities, it being held to be a book for homiletic interpretation.
Yeah, homiletics is biblical interpretations. It's just a fancy word that the rabbis use. And let's see, over here. And what's really interesting, it omits all the kings of the northern kingdom, right? Remember, those are the 10 lost tribes, right? It just omits them completely. Not important to the narrative. They lost, right? We're the inheritors. It never mentions the Exodus from Egypt. Really fascinating. Think of how prominent the Exodus from Egypt is in our liturgy and stories. They don't mention it. Any time that the Israelites didn't live in the land, again, the political agenda, we are here, this is our land, we have a right to this land, right? I think of when the early pioneers went to Israel, they were from Europe, they worked very hard, did the best they could. After the Holocaust, the new younger generation, they needed Jews not to be seen as victims, right? That's when we started hearing about the story of Masada as a heroic story, which I don't believe it is. That's when we start to hear the story of the Maccabees, which again is not on our Tanakh. But the Jews in coming up to 48, they needed to show Jews as heroes. They didn't want to show Jews as victims. Well, these Jews needed to show that the Israelites had a right to this land. So any stories from outside the land, they weren't interested in, and Chronicles doesn't mention. It highlights the Davidic monarchy again, that the whole issue that the Messiah is going to come from David, places him, front and center forever. They highlight the temple and emphasis on just the Torah, that this is what's important. And if someone wants to read this part, Michelle, you up for reading?
Sure. When Chronicles was written, it must have stunned the Jews who already knew the bleak king's narrative and who may still have felt rejected by God. Instead of being a secondary book to Samuel and Kings, Chronicles functions as a prophecy and conveys religious messages to people of its time. Chronicles teaches God's relationship with Israel and the house of David is stable and eternal, and that there is full continuity with the past.
And there are scholars that believe that this was written as late as 200 BCE. But don't forget, they went back in like the late 500, well, the early 400s, late 500s, like 539 BCE. But anyway, as late as 200 BCE, that they're a little bit trying to rewrite history to justify their own times, perhaps.
Some things never change, do they?
Some things never change, exactly. And that's Chronicles. Then we get to the book of Daniel, which is perhaps the most confusing book of the Bible, up there with Ezekiel. Give me 1 second. Yes. Yes. Daniel is an apocalyptic book, and apocalyptic writing has to do with what happens at the end of days. And it's something that I have no interest in it. I have a friend that's been working on a master's for forever in apocalyptic writing, but it all has to do with revelation of God, the end of days. You've probably heard modern references to the apocalypse. I know there've been modern films with that in its name, but we have this as well in our writings. It's mystical in many ways and odd in many ways. The first part is a series of stories of the Jews in Babylonia during the exile. So it's again before Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's 6 chapters long. So it's not very long, and it's mostly a collection of stories. Sorry, fire truck. And probably penned by different authors, and it's mostly written in the third person. Okay, so it's sort of a narrative. And Daniel seems to be maybe a minister to pagan kings, a little bit like Joseph. And in fact, as we'll see, he interprets dreams for the non-Jewish king, which is very much like Joseph. The first part of these stories, the second part are visions for the future. And some, as I said, are written in Aramaic. In fact, from the middle of chapter 4 through the middle of chapter 7. Before and after this are Hebrew. And of course, the chapters, by the way, don't get too thrown off about that, because the chapter divisions were not done by Jews. The chapter divisions were done by Christian clergy at some point in the, I don't know, early Middle Ages or something, or earlier. And those are we didn't really discuss that, but those are the chapters that we use today. So the fact that it happens in the middle of a chapter doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, somebody just stopped writing in Hebrew and started writing in Aramaic. No, they are probably different documents that have been glued together. Let's see, 1 second. Some believe that the whole of it was originally written in Aramaic, and that the beginning and ending were translated into Hebrew, so that the rabbis would allow it to be included in the Bible. Because it's an interesting issue. The Bible's entirely Hebrew, except for this part of Daniel and a little bit of what was, and I forgot what a book it was, I think in Ezra a little bit. And the Talmud, on the other hand, is written in Aramaic primarily, because that was the lingua franca, that was the language of the people at the time. But those rabbis that spoke in Aramaic, who sort of put together the canon of the Tanakh, Hebrew's the holy language. You know, why did they allow an Aramaic document into the holy canon? And so there are those that truly believe that the Hebrew was added to give it credence. Of course, we have no idea when it was written. And they can tell this because of when the scholars look at the language and the intertextual events, like trying to piece together these things. They're saying, no, there's no way this was written during the time of the expulsion, even though that's where it was set. There's even evidence that it wasn't written after the exile, because there are references that they just couldn't possibly have known. So actually, most people believe it was written around the time of the Hanukkah story, around the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. So it's sort of also intriguing when you think of that. Now, who is Daniel? He's supposed to be one of these Jews exiled, and he was a soothsayer or an advisor in Nebuchadnezzar's court. There are three very well-known stories from this book that even if you don't actually know them, when we talk about them, you say, oh, that's where this is from. The first one is the fiery furnace, and it features these two friends of his or students of his, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, the Christians know more about this than we do typically. And in fact, I don't know if you ever showed your children Veggie Tales, which was a cartoon system based on the Bible that was Christian in nature, but really great material because it's all pre-Jesus. So they all, like they did the Book of Ruth and Esther and all these things, and they came up with sort of funny names for these three, and they're like cartoon characters in the Veggie Tales. So there's this idol that's set up, and everyone's supposed to bow down to it, and the punishment is if you don't bow down to it, you're tossed into a fiery furnace. Now, it sounds, again, a little bit like the Hanukkah story, if you think about it, right? Everyone has to bow down to Antiochus, and of course, Mattathias doesn't. So these three men refuse to bow down, and they're tossed into the furnace, and they're not burned up. Right now, we hear little shadows of the burning bush, right? They're not burned up. And not only that, but when the king sees them in the furnace, must have been a really big, furnace, they're walking around, and there's a fourth character that the king then believes is an angel of God who's there to protect them. And so when they come out of this unscathed, not even their hair is singed, their clothing isn't burnt, according to the story, the king believes that this is an act of God, and basically then gives into them. The next story, the king has a dream, and in the dream, there is a hand writing words on the wall. This is where we get the phrase, the handwriting on the wall, okay? That they can't see the handwriting on the wall or whatever it is. And the phrase is this weird phrase in Hebrew, Menei menei tekel ufarsim. Who knows what it means? And somebody says, oh, there's this guy, Daniel, who can interpret dreams. Again, reminiscent of the story of Joseph. And he comes in to interpret this dream for the king. And it does say that God has numbered your kingdom. And in fact, soon thereafter, the king dies. So it comes true. The king doesn't benefit, but it comes true. So that's the second of the three stories. And the third one, in chapter 6, is the one that you probably have most heard of, even if you don't know what the story is, and that's Daniel in the lion's den.
Oh, yeah.
And right, Daniel in the lion's den, like, what is that story? And again, the Christians really, I think, deal with these stories way more than we do. They're much more interested in general in the apocalyptic writings because it all has to do with messiahs and, the future. And Jews tend to say, we'll just live this life. We'll worry about the next life later. And so we know of this story, but it's really only from Christian sources that our kids would have any familiarity with it. So what happens? Well, the other ministers are jealous of Daniel, who's ministering to the king and whatnot, and they seek his downfall. And so they make this statue of Darius, and everyone has to bow down to it. And now the punishment for not bowing down to the statue is being thrown into a lion's den, which also gives rise to the fact that this could have happened around the time of Antiochus. So we're already getting very close to when the Greeks and the Romans would throw people into the arena, right, to fight lions. And Daniel refuses to bow down to Darius. He's a good Jew. He prays 3 times a day. And so the king has no choice, even though he loves Daniel, to throw him into the lion's den. And the king says, God will protect you. And he survives the night and comes out unscathed. and all the plotted against him and their wives and their families are tossed into the same lion's den and killed. And again, it's a little bit reminiscent maybe of the Purim story where Haman and his wife and his sons, right, who had plotted against the Jew, is killed. So a lot of echoes of other stories in this. So that's Daniel, at least as much as Daniel as I'll do, because it's very, out there. And then finally we get to the book of Job. And for many people, this is perhaps the most important book of the Bible because it addresses the issue of what happens when bad things happen to good people in a certain sense. And you can see this beautiful, beautiful quote from Rabbi James Punnett, who I don't know. But this is a book that many people say, oh yeah, I know Job, but they haven't actually read it. It is long. It's not easy to read, even in the English, and it can be very confusing. And the theology of it can be a little troubling. For me, and you'll see why, if you remember the film with Eddie Murphy called Trading Places, Trading Places? I think Trading Places. Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, right? Dan Aykroyd's this rich guy, and these two old men say, oh, I wonder what happens if we switch places, make him poor and make this guy on the street rich. This is basically the story of Job, the Dan Aykroyd character. So when was it written? Well, again, of course, we don't know. And the material that I found was so all over the board that, like, I have to say, who cares, right? Like, I hear that you scholars, I hear that you want to date it. It doesn't matter. There's a universal message in this book, so that the timing of the story doesn't matter. What happens? So again, it's like this Trading Places story. Job is a nice guy. He's wealthy. He loves God. He does everything he's supposed to do. He follows the commandments. He has a wife. He has children. He has a large farm or whatever. And well, wait. I think I want to share with you before I go too far. Let me just see my notes. Hello. Okay. Okay, he lives in a place called Uz. I don't know where that's supposed to be. He's blameless and upright. He fears God. So then, wealthier than anybody around. And then, does somebody want to read? Because it's quite telling. Somebody want to read in English?
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
One day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord, and the adversary came along with them.
Okay, now just to look at the words in red in Hebrew. The divine beings are called in Hebrew B'nai Ha-Elohim, which literally means the sons of the gods. Who are these people? Now in the creation story, we have other divine beings. We don't know who these folks are. And it's a big issue with the Christians that these are the children of God, because that allows God to have children, which allows Jesus to be the Son of God. And then the adversary, if you look in the Hebrew, if you can read Hebrew, Hasatan. We talked about this earlier. This is Satan. Okay, so Satan is among them. Keep going.
The Lord said to the adversary, "Where have you been?" The adversary answered the Lord, "I have been roaming all
Oh, sorry.
I have been roaming all over the earth." The Lord said to the adversary, "Have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil." The adversary answered the Lord, "Does Job not have good reason to fear God?
No,
Why?"
what's the good reason? What's the good reason that Job would love God so much? His life is great.
Right.
No, but
It's easy to love God when your life is great.
Oh.
All right, keep going.
Why it is you who have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has. You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face.
Right? So Satan says, take it all away and then see if he loves you so much.
Right.
Right? Let's get a little bet here, right? Let's have a little bet. Let's play with the human and have a little bet. So everything disappears. His children are killed. His wife is killed. He loses all of his property. He loses all of his animals. There's disease. He's left with nothing. And it says he arose. He tears his clothes, he cuts his hair again, a sign of mourning, throws himself on the ground and
Worshipped.
worships. He says, naked, my translation might be different than yours, but naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I'll return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. For all that, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach upon God. Pretty amazing, right? To be a person of that faith, to say, well, it's all for a reason. It's not for me to question. God's still great. I don't know why this happened to me. Now, he does have friends in the book. They're introduced, and they're all silent. They don't say a word. They watch their friends' world fall apart, and they say nothing. So after they're silent, though, time passes, then they start to offer reasons why he must have brought this on himself. And think about that in modern human behavior. All too often, when we hear someone has bad news, we don't reach out. We're afraid. We don't want to bother them. We're worried maybe they're embarrassed, right? It's not always our Emily Post reaction to go and call them and say, I'm thinking of you. I've had to force myself to call some of the African Americans that I know either in my congregation or that I've worked with. Unfortunately, I can't say that I have social friends that are African American, but I had to force myself to call them and say, over this past year, I'm thinking of you and your children, because my first reaction was, oh, I don't want to bother them. And this is so hard. And it's not my problem, right? And then think about the number of times you've heard people, not maliciously, but it's part of human nature to say, oh, well, you're not doing so, the divorce, oh, she must have done something, or he must have done something, right? Or they have a kid who's, God forbid, wrapped up in drugs, and well, there must have been something in the way they raised the child, right? We are so quick to put blame.
Right.
Sometimes I think because we want the world to make sense. We don't want to think that it is so random. So his friends start to offer all kinds of reasons why he must have brought this on himself. And they say, you must not have done what God asked you to do, because God doesn't punish the faithful. See, it's also part of their world. They can't accept a world where bad things happen to good people. In addition to the fact, but think about when you do sometimes talk to a friend about bad times, you don't always want their opinion. You just want to vent. You just want them to listen. It's like I had to learn from my daughter, who's a social worker. Just listen. Don't come up with solutions for them. They're not asking you for solutions. They just need to share how horrible they feel. It's a really tough lesson to learn.
Mhm.
So the rabbis who, actually, I can't see all this either. So somebody else want to read, Naomi? You want to give it a shot?
Sure. The rabbis of the Talmud, who shaped and sealed the biblical canon, could not agree whether the book of Job was to be read as an historic account or a moral parable, or whether its protagonistic was Jew or Gentile. But somehow they knew that the book of Job had to be included in the Hebrew Bible.
Right? They didn't argue, as they did with other books, whether or not it should be in the canon, but they just couldn't figure out, what is this book, right? What's its purpose? Why do we have it? Where did it come from? The lessons from this book are huge, and I'm not a huge student of the book of Job. I have a very close friend in Raleigh who is this is his book. He's a Jew by choice. I think it was partly this book that actually brought him to Judaism, because Job's allowed to question, and my friend Mike was allowed to question. And in his upbringing, his Gentile upbringing, questioning was not encouraged. So Mike.
That's very attractive I'm a converted Jew, so that's very attractive to people who were never allowed to question and had very pressing questions about why,
Absolutely. And what was interesting to me once, I was pretty young, and I took a course. It was in DC, and it was for educators, and it was actually given all in Hebrew. And I was like at the bottom of the pile, hanging on for dear life to try to understand what was going on in the class. And all the other teachers were day school teachers, Orthodox women at yeshiva, basically, and they had modern Hebrew. And I was astounded. I think it was the story of Jacob or Joseph. And I was astounded at how these women attacked the main character. Like, they're really questioning the motives. Must have been Jacob and the the deception that he had, stealing his birthright and those kinds of things. And I remember saying to them towards the end of the class, like, I'm so impressed that you all are questioning this. And they said to me, we can question because we know what the answer is going to be. Right? Like they felt comfortable questioning because they knew it was going to come back to, because this is how God set it up. Now, I don't have that theological relationship. So questioning can sometimes be dangerous, right? If you don't know where it might lead you. So some of the lessons that we have from this, it had become necessary at the time, perhaps it was written, that obedience to the law would be rewarded and transgression punished. And it became necessary to say, guys, that doesn't always follow. Now, what do you think was going on that they felt they had to explain that the world isn't that simple? It was bad times. Right? Can you imagine saying to a person going to the gas chambers, well, it's because you didn't light Shabbos candles often enough, right? You can't accept that relationship with God when things are horrible and awful. There's a lesson people take away from it that he must be guilty. That's certainly one way to look at it. His guilt's assumed. No one thinks of doubting it. That's a lesson, and it becomes the responsibility of the sufferer to find out why he sinned. Right. So that's what was going on at the time, and we're thinking, no, this can't be right.
That's very harsh.
Very harsh, right?
Right.
So then Job responds, and that we learn that, oh, guess what? The sufferer can complain. Job's angry with God, but he dialogues with God. He doesn't give up, right? So you're allowed to be angry with God. That's fine. That's a relationship with God. To walk away from the idea that there's something divine, then we've lost, right? Whether you have a good life or a bad life. And catastrophes of this nature, guess what? We were given with free will. If you have that, we're given with free will, and Hitler made his mind to do what he did, and God doesn't always do things. Now, in this story, of course, God did do these things, but the people who are reading the story need to understand we don't understand what goes on, and good people suffer at the hand of God, and bad people sometimes don't.
So I have a question.
Please.
Was Job a real person?
No, the research that I did basically said nobody thinks that he was. But I'm sure that there's some fundamentalists that say absolutely he was. So, that's a hard one. I mean, to me, the story's gotten a lot more power if written as a parable.
I wonder, one of the things that I learned about slavery was that the slaves were often, sent to church, where in a sense they were taught that, well, their position was a result of some bad behavior. Or I could see that this book could be used also, like, well, it's just the way it is, it's just,
It's your dumb luck, right?
Yeah, pure dumb luck.
It's your dumb luck. So you are allowed to complain. We know that the wicked often live to the end of their days very nicely, which is so annoying. And no power on earth should take away your knowledge if you are innocent. On the drive up here, I listened to, I'm trying to think, it must have been NPR, and maybe someone, or there's stories constantly about this, but I listened to an interview, I guess, with a man who, I know, he was part of the group of young men that were accused of raping a woman in Central Park, and incarcerated for a number of years, and were released, lived on parole. One of them recently died, unfortunately. And this young man was saying, he was 24 when he got out of prison, then he lived on parole, which he said is not life. Like, it's not easy living on parole. And he'd missed his entire adolescence. And how do you meet people? How do you relate to women? All these things. When you knew the whole time you were innocent. And what's worse is in prison, so he was a sex offender. And in order to get out, he had to go to all kinds of classes admitting that he was a sex offender, but he wasn't. right? And so he didn't go to the classes. And so, that whole relationship. And so it's powerful for someone to read this book and say, I know what's true. I know I'm a good person. The fact that bad things are happening to me, that's just the way it is. But you're not going to tell me it's my fault.
And if they go on parole, they have to accept the fact that they have to say, yes, I was guilty and I have remorse for it. They can't say, I didn't do it. I am innocent. You won't get parole.
Right. Ultimately to get out, you have to say that. Yeah, it's horrific. And yet, I mean, I understand that if it's a guilty person, that is what we want from them, right? But it's a very difficult issue. Okay. So the negative results reached by the arguments, what's been called divine justice, is it really just God saying, hey, I'm in charge, I can do anything I want, which is not a great way to view the divine, that we're all just puppets. Is the divine devoid of all moral qualities, all these things that the prophets have told us? Is God also not held accountable to these things? And actually, if you read a lot of Wiesel and others, they rail against God, like, live by your own book, right? In our simple terms. That the fortune and calamity are, not connected to anything, which is very unsettling. Right? You want to believe that I work hard, I follow the rules, and there will be a reward. That's why a little bit in Christian theology about the world to come giving you those rewards is very comforting. Because if you're suffering in this world, of course, that's through the Middle Ages, that's what they fed all those serfs and peasants to build all those cathedrals. But don't worry, you're suffering now, but you'll have a good life in the world to come. And mind you, that's also present in Judaism. There are stories and legends having to do with this. It's just not something that we focus on for the most part. The Hasidim do more than we do. But I remember having a little kid's book. It wasn't a little kid's book, but it was a book of stories about rabbis. And I loved this book. And I went back to revisit it and I was appalled. One of my favorite stories was about a righteous woman. And they believed that every time you did a mitzvah, another stitch was sewn in the beautiful robe that you would wear in the world to come. And so these men see angels flying with a beautiful, magnificent robe between them, airing it out, and the men are determined to find whose robe is this? This man must be amazing. And they finally find the man. And it's not the man who's amazing, it's the woman. And the story is holding up that her good deeds made such a beautiful robe for her husband. And she's so wonderful that the angels were starting on one for her also.
Oh my.
I thought, how could I be? I read this as a kid. I loved this story. I all but burned the book. I certainly didn't read it to my children. But some of the positive lessons that we get from this book, that we can't exclude. We have to look at things together. And there's a danger when you separate it. And so here the poet declares many of the phenomena in nature are manifestations of omnipotence, that, like, sit back a little bit. God's got a plan. Like, there is just as it's capricious and horrible to think about, there's also some comfort to say, we don't know. We don't know what the true meaning of life is. And maybe this is all part of it. So you can look at these from both sides. And that because of this, we should just enjoy the ride. A little bit of what Kohelet says, right? You're going to die anyway. So you may as well just enjoy the ride. And by the way, the positive view, folks, God was not the one that put this in motion. It was Satan's fault, right? Satan was the one that goaded God into doing this, which is also a very troubling view of God, but so intriguing. So what happens at the end of the book? I'm sure you want to know. Diane, go ahead.
Although I'm looking at it right now as God did it to show Satan what true devotion was and what true believing is all about. Here, he stripped this man of everything that he had, but the man still had faith. So maybe that's what God's trying to do.
Right. And that works if we're talking about faith in something beyond us, right? That you still hold on to that faith. You're not broken. It doesn't work if you try to bring it down to earth and you think, well, no matter how many times the husband abuses that woman, his wife, she's still going to stick with him, right? Like, so what messages are we giving here? It's a little tricky.
Yeah.
So what happens in the end? God punishes Job's friends, but actually not until after. Oh, I'm sorry. He punishes the friends, and Job actually begs God not to, and God eventually relents. And God restores everything to Job. He marries again. He has children. He has more wealth than ever before. And the book ends with this line. And after this, Job lived 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. And Job died being old and full of days. Again, we have hope that survivors of the Holocaust that were able to rebuild their lives, often with new spouses, with new families, never forgetting, but being able to live life and enjoy it. And we have also those that can't. So maybe the lesson is, take what's dealt to you, make the best of it, keep your chin up, keep smiling, keep going.
Enjoy it when you have it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Leon Roth, actually, I don't know who Leon Roth is, but I have a quote from him that says, the book of Job turns on the question of the nature of religion. Can people serve God for naught? When Job says, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him, he vindicates both himself and God. That what is the nature of religion? What is this faith? And I would argue that as much as we talk about the relationship between God and humanity as parent-child, we almost have to stop doing that, because as I pointed out, it doesn't work on a human level. It can only work with something so far beyond our understanding, and then that's true faith. Okay, and I think, okay, so did it happen? Is it true? So Rambam, Maimonides, in his Guide to the Perplexed, wrote, and he bases it on a Talmudic opinion, that the biblical character never existed. And but he doesn't deny or diminish in any way the enduring truth of the story, right? The stories have to be true in order to have a truth in which God's creatures cry out in pain and outrage in the face of unjust human suffering, which we should continue to do. We should rail against God when things are not fair. That's okay.
But did Job really do that? Did Job rail against that?
He does. In the book, he does rail against God. And he argues, right? He argues with God. He doesn't lose his faith, but he argues with God over this, that this is not fair. This is not just. So that brings us to the end of the Tanakh, and one of my favorite quotes from Rabbi Hanina. I've learned much from my teachers and even more from my friends, but from my students, I've learned more than from all of them. Chazak, chazak, b'ni chazik. We should all go from strength to strength. This has been truly a fabulous experience for me.
It's been wonderful.
Yes.
And I love learning with all of you. I love working with the Wilmington community. I do hope that Rabbi Bender and I will find other ways for me to be helpful in the community. It's really, it's been quite great for me.
It's been great.
We'll put in a good word for you.
Yeah, I think the kids really enjoyed you too.
Yeah.
So
I really felt like they did well, and I think that we got along pretty well. I loved the last day we had with them. Michelle, thank you so much for helping out.
that was so much fun.
It's actually, though, let me share with you that whoever wonderfully packed up all those things, which I actually didn't intend to bring home. I intended to leave for your religious school, but it's fine. I'll donate them to my religious school. But you may remember you ran to get pencils, or someone did, and that whole box of pencils and things came back to my house. So the next time someone goes to the beach, they'll drop it off at the synagogue, because that should go back to the school. Okay, well, the kids are.
We'll invite you for the rededication of the sanctuary.
Oh, I would love to be there.
Yes.
Do you have a date?
No,
Not yet.
no, not yet. We got to wait for the rabbi to come back in 2 weeks, and
Also, wait till things really lift.
And we're waiting for the menorahs to go up. That's the finish.
Yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You did a wonderful job.
It was my pleasure. And the kids are asleep, so I'm gonna get off and have some dinner. So
I hope they're not too sick.
No.
No, but it's like 3 days of temperature. It's not nothing. They were COVID tested. It came out negative. So we'll see. But it's going to be a long weekend. So
They're lucky to have you.
We'll be thinking of you.
thanks. Bye all.
Shabbat shalom.
Good night.
Bye bye. Good night, guys.
Good
Good
night.
night. Night, everyone.